First, I'm going to talk to you about the differences between criminal and civil proceedings. The first difference is between who files the case. In criminal cases, the government is filing against a citizen who has committed a crime. In civil cases, it's a conflict between two people. In criminal cases, it's also trial by jury, whereas in civil, it's just decided by a judge. In criminal court, if you can't afford an attorney, they will provide one for you, whereas in civil court, if you can't afford one, you have to represent yourself. The severity of punishments in criminal courts is more severe than those in civil courts. For example, if you're proven guilty in criminal courts, you can possibly go to jail, face high fines, probation, and community service. In civil court, you either have to pay money to the person that's suing you, or you will have to stop doing a certain act or whatever got you there in the first place. Lastly, the standard of proof is different. For criminal court, you need to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that they're guilty. And then for civil, you have to do it by the preponderance of evidence. The next topic is procedural and substantial due process. Due process is the fair treatment through the judicial system. Substantive due process deals with the government's infringement on individuals' fundamental rights, which are stated in the Bill of Rights, such as freedom of speech and freedom of religion. Also included are the abstract liberty rights, which are self-determination, bodily integrity, personal anatomy, and self-dignity. In the court case of Einstead v. Bard, the state of Massachusetts made it illegal for the distribution of contraceptive pills to unmarried persons. The Supreme Court then decided that that statute was unconstitutional because it went against the substantive due process and that unmarried persons have a right to decide whether they want a child or not. In the famous court case of Roe v. Wade, the Supreme Court declared that not allowing a woman to abort within the first trimester of her pregnancy was an infringement upon abstract liberty interests, and therefore ruled that women had the right to do that. Procedural due process is the standard of steps for the process of arresting and trying someone suspected of committing a crime. Procedural due process also covers any action from the government that deprives a person of life, liberty, or property. The government can't deprive you of anything that you're entitled to, as far as a home, something that you take out of your house that's yours, unless it causes a safety issue or hazard for people around you. The procedural due process also prevents the government from depriving you of your liberty unless you're in prison, because when you're in prison you don't have any liberties. Now I'm going to talk about how law came to America. Common law originated in England, which was set up by judges who made court decisions based off the people's morals and customs and beliefs of the time. The judges kept the order and the peace for the kings that were in power. By the 1600s, the judges had already established a few statutory laws and criminal offenses. Once the colonists began to leave England and arrive in America, they created the colonies and they established governors, council members, and judges. They modified the English common law to adapt to their needs in the colonies. After the Revolutionary War, newly freed Americans didn't want Britain's laws and order still being enforced upon us. So basically we just used the common law as guidelines and definitions for our own setup of laws called statutory laws. A legislative body, the Founding Fathers, wrote the Constitution after the failure of the Articles of Confederation, and then law and order was pretty much in place. Common law typically isn't used today. Some states make statutes based off common law, but mainly it's just used for definitions. As already talked about, we had a court case in 1812. Hudson and Goodwin were charged with libel, which is a common law crime, at a federal level. But the Constitution bans federal jurisdiction from charging on common law ground. So basically they got off because the federal courts couldn't charge them unless the state decided to charge them for libel. Then constitutional law identifies the extension of our government's authority. As our nations evolved and modernized, we interpret the Constitution in different ways, therefore sometimes amendments are made. Constitutional law for the individual gives them the ability to charge people for infringing on their rights. The two most common cases related to this would be due process rights and equal protection. An important court case involving constitutional law was Gideon v. Wainwright, and that occurred in Florida Gideon was charged of a felony, and he showed up for his court date and asked to be given a lawyer, appointed a lawyer, and the Florida courts denied him. Florida law wouldn't appoint him a lawyer because, according to a statute, an attorney may only be appointed to an indignant defendant in capital cases. He then petitioned to the Florida Supreme Court to say that his rights were infringed upon because he wasn't appointed a lawyer, and they denied his right. So the case ended up going to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, with a 9-0 vote, decided that the state and federal courts must respect the right of the accused to be represented by counsel by request, and that all the protection of the due process clause should be applied to all cases. Case laws are the laws that are formed based on former court decisions. The Supreme Court is the highest in all the land, so whatever they decide is final and binding for state and federal courts. If a court has a case that is similar to a previous case that's already been ruled, then that court makes a similar ruling or similar sentence as the one previous to it. Statutory laws, as kind of talked about when we were discussing common law into the U.S., is established by legislation, and then it's approved by the president or sometimes vetoed by the president. And at a state level, it would be the governor. Statutes that are passed are then turned over by another legislative statute that's passed, or is deemed unconstitutional by courts. Statutory law is very precise and point blank, unlike case law and common law, which can kind of be interpreted. In relationships, statutory laws of the criminal justice system. A criminal breaks a statutory law, and that is why they're being charged. They're being charged with a crime, which would be breaking a law. Basically, an ex post facto law is a criminal law made retroactive to punish prior conduct not criminal when done. And there is a clause that also says not only can a law be made retroactively to charge something that's already been done, but it can aggravate or increase the severity of a punishment on a crime. It cannot require less evidence or more evidence when trying to prove someone guilty compared to past legislation. Ex post facto laws protect citizens of every race, gender, religion that could be discriminated against. The burden of proof in criminal proceedings is all on the prosecutor. The defendant, if they don't want to, doesn't need to prove anything. They don't have to have a defense. The prosecutor, which would be the government in criminal court cases, would need to prove the guiltiness of the defendant. One proves the guiltiness of a defendant by actus reus and mens rea, which is a guilty act and a guilty mind. So they need to prove not only that they did the act, but that they had malicious intent behind it. Not only do they have to prove actus rea and mens rea, but they have to prove that it occurred at the same time and beyond a reasonable doubt. Beyond a reasonable doubt means it is not enough to prove it was more likely than not that an element of a crime was true. The proof must be such that a reasonable person could not conclude the element was not true. Next, I need to talk about legal elements of crimes. This is a 5 short list of actus rea, mens rea, concurrence, causation, and resulting crime or injury. Actus rea, as just talked about, is action, and it's the person committing the crime and doing it. Mens rea is the guilty mind, the guilty thought, the intent. Concurrence means that mens rea and the intent happen at the same time. Causation is typically only involved when there's a third party. So if someone got injured or someone was involved, then you have to ask yourself, was the crime the proximate cause of that issue or that injury? Resulting crime or injury would result from someone's action. So if they were going to rob a bank, the resulting crime would be a robbery. Or injury would be with a murder or serious injuries, bodily harm, battery, arson, any of those things. Omission to act is typically not a crime because no person has the duty to serve a stranger in distress, but there are exceptions for cops and lifeguards and sometimes spouses and parents to children. They have a duty to act because they're either held by contract, by relationship. Specific intent crimes include solicitation, attempt, conspiracy, theft crimes, intent to murder, and voluntary manslaughter. And then general intent crimes include rape, battery, arson, mayhem, involuntary manslaughter. There are so many criminal defenses. You can literally pull out basically anything to defend your crime and to see if it works. We have crazy ones like sugar rush defense, or a not so crazy one like self defense. The defense of insanity, which technically insanity is not a clinically proven issue. It's more just a broad spectrum of mental disorders or mental dysfunctions that at the time of the crime, the person was claimed insane. There are insanity tests to prove that a person is insane. Typically, people don't use the insanity defense unless it's a high charge, like possibly murder, but only 2% of murder charges end up using the insanity defense, anyways. If someone is proven innocent by the claim of insanity or by the defense of insanity, then after the court date, they are typically sent to a mental hospital, and then they're given a burden of proof where they have to prove that they aren't insane before they're released. Self-defense, or the defense of another, is another valid defense that a lot of people use in court. You must keep in mind that the defense can only be used against someone that is doing something unlawful. Their actions need to cause immediate harm in a way that you have to act in an aggressive way. So the act of force needs to be necessary, and the amount of force that you use against them must be reasonable. Another defense used is the battered woman's defense. This was used in 2007 in Tennessee. A lady shot her husband and then in court claimed that it was because he had sexually and physically abused her during their marriage. And she also claimed that the shotgun went off by accident. The jury was consisting of mostly women, and she ended up, instead of getting a 12-year to possibly life sentence, she got a 3 to 6 year sentence. Ignorance of a law is not a defense. It's typically assumed that everyone knows the law and everyone can understand the law. Mistake of fact is a defense. For example, if someone is hunting and they think they're going to shoot a fox, but they end up shooting a man, that would be a mistake of fact. Duress and coercion and compulsion are all defenses that involve someone telling you or forcing you to do something. They require the defendant to admit to committing the crime, but then say, I have a reason, I was forced to, there was a threat against me, and the threat needs to be possibly them threatening to take your life or serious bodily harm. Duress is the defense, and coercion is the person that is asking you to do these things. Another defense that can be used is an alibi, and with the situation of an alibi, you have to prove that you weren't at the crime scene at the time that it occurred. There was no way that you could be there, and you have to prove where you were. Thank you for watching, and I hope that I was super clear in explaining these elements of criminal law.